Great, thanks everyone. Thanks for your enthusiastic participation and not requiring any assistance whatsoever. So hopefully that means that it was all clear and you found it useful and interesting. Obviously you can download this tool, you can play with it in your own situations, apply it to your own issues. Listen, I'm aware that we talked about a couple of things here this morning. Both of these big events that I used as examples, I realize it can be a very real and affecting and triggering. So if that has been the case for you and you would like to talk to someone about that, the Fulfilling Lives staff are definitely available and open to that at lunch if that would be helpful. These are big and real and complex problems, and they, of course, affect us all. So, moving on to the next session. So I'd like to invite our panel to come and join me up here. So Diane Smith. Is Diane Smith anywhere in the room? Of course, who you know. I think has already been introduced this morning. So Di has obviously had a program as a Fulfilling Lives London. You can have this one here in the middle. And we're also joined this morning by Nadine Smith. Round of applause, please, for Nadine Smith. Woo! Sorry, I'm not as good at the woos as Rachel. So as she makes her way up, I'll just introduce her. Yeah, feel free to take that chair. There's a little thing. No relation. Believe it or not, there are two Smiths, and they're not related. Who'd have thought? So Nadine is a former Cabinet Office campaigns and strategy advisor, and has worked in various departments in both news and policy, including social exclusion and social mobility. She's a former communications director at the Institute for Government and a former founding director of the Centre for Public Impact. Nadine has spent the majority of her career seeking answers to complex challenges. She's been at the forefront of crisis response, understanding how to listen and learn better from failures. She's been on a quest. You've been on a quest, apparently. Yeah. To understand how to build legitimacy and increase public participation. Has a particular interest in building empathic and inclusive listening spaces. Nadine is currently a director at Social Finance UK, helping to connect governments, communities, and supporting places and people to work together to make lives better. Whew. I think that deserves another round of applause for Nadine.
Oh, no.
yeah. and for
I am 96.
So thanks guys for joining us for this afternoon's discussion on systems leadership. So we're going to spend half an hour talking about the concept of systems leadership, what it means, how it's different to other forms of leadership, more traditional forms of leadership, how it plays out in practice, why we need it, etc. And hopefully thinking about how it sort of specifically has played out in some of the programs that we've been involved in and coming programs as well. And Nadine's going to talk a little bit about some of that sort of future work. So let's start with some definitions, and these can be your own, if that's okay. Nadine, do you mind if I start with you on the first one? So what is meant, at least to you, by systems leadership?
This is like, there are so many books out there that will give you so many different definitions of what a systems leader looks like, should be like, how they should speak, what they should believe. And I think the more I've tried to nail it down, the more I've realized that I'm going to fall into the trap of prescribing a systems leader. And really, there's room for everyone to be a systems leader. And the great thing about being a systems leader is I don't think you need the word leader in your title. I think you can be anyone, anywhere. You don't have to have a job to do that. You can create change and see connections between people and places just from your own community, from your own doorstep. But I know that people do crave a definition, and I found a couple, but they were really unsatisfying. So one was somebody who understands the art and science of making reliable inferences about the behavior of systems by developing an increasingly deep understanding of their underlying structure. And if you're not already bored, why not? In reality, I think some would say it's just a person who understands how to consider reality, can gain a better understanding of culture, context, and complexity, that allows that really deep and mature understanding of actors and factors in a system and the interconnectedness between them and the relationships that you need to build in order to make things work. If you know that, then you are already on your way, if not already, a systems leader. I think, though, just very briefly, I have just been on a weekend kind of reflection, which is very great and very zen, where just listening to other people's kind of perspectives on this new kind of type of leadership, if you like. But actually, it's not new at all. You can find, the roots in like real systems leaders kind of right back in time from indigenous nations who understood that this kind of how sacred their land was, the interconnectedness between the land, the planet, their people, and those who walk on it, the impact that they have, and the intricacies of the connectedness of all of that, and the responsibility that you have to make things grow. And that comes from way back in time. If anything, we're going back to that time. We're not reinventing some kind of new leadership. And I've also found some interesting definitions in servant leadership, which is also a quite old and well-told story of the servant leader, doesn't want to be a leader, reluctantly kind of finds something that needs to be solved or injustices that need to be kind of quashed, and reluctantly finds themselves in a position where no one is doing anything and they're looking to them. And then they realize that their purpose. So systems leaders have a purpose. Sometimes that's purpose that other people have created for them. Or sometimes they just have it in them. They were born with it. So I think there's some interesting kind of ways of thinking about it, but most of them think with their heart as well as their head. But it's not warm and fluffy to me. It's not someone who likes to cuddle people all day and just doesn't do the job and doesn't get on with it. They know when to take action too, and they know when they need to take that action decisively. So I would say that systems leaders are sometimes given a bit of bad press in jobs where people say in power, we just want to get it done. We just want to deliver. Just get it done. I mean, I've had that said to me before. And get it done doesn't really get much done at all, and actually can cause a lot of harm. So I would say there's a lot of humility in being a systems leader, and it's very hard work. And I see people get very exhausted by it. So I hope at some point we can talk about the ebbs and flows of system leadership and how we can manage the emotion cycle as well of going through that change and trying to bring people with you and yourself having to adapt all the time. But learning and relationships always play a part. Sorry, that was very long because, as I said, there's no one definition. I hope that's given you some food for thought, though, Diane.
I think we're done, right?
Oh,
yeah. Okay. Anything to add?
Anyone that knows me, I've probably got all those books that you've talked about in Nadine, but not read them. So I think I definitely resonate with. I'm not taking away your speech, but definitely resonate in what you're saying in terms of. And I talked about it this morning in terms of those great thinkers. I think a person that can sit with that uncertainty and be curious and also be compassionate with it and just focus on creating that space around you. And there's lots of system changes and system leaders around the sector, but they're not necessarily the ones with the title. And I think opening the doors to those people and making that space around the table is really critical as well, both with lived and learned experience as well. So yeah, so it's not the academic response, I'm afraid.
So is there a sort of element of it's hard to sort of talk about these things without sort of descending into very fluffy language, like holding space, isn't it? And kind of like, sort of like creating spaces, nurturing spaces in which, different people within that system can can lead it? Is it about kind of that? So I'm interested in this relationship between, because on the one hand, Nadine, you're talking about anyone can be a systems leader, right? So there's that kind of component of like liberated leadership, sort of taking the concept of leadership from what it's become, the sort of the hero, this kind of myth of the hero leader, right, who's going to sort of solve everything for us, liberating ourselves from that idea and understanding that kind of leadership exists at all levels of the system, and that idea can be actually counterproductive and unhelpful, and can limit other forms of leadership taking hold in the system. So it seems that there is a role for the kind of the single leader, but it's almost like the anti-leader. But also the concept of systems leadership, as I understand you were framing it, also, allows space for other people to take different forms of leadership, whether they're called leaders or not, in whatever form that might. Is that a kind of fair reflection?
Yeah, I think the good thing about systems leadership is that you can emerge as I said, you can emerge as a leader, and you don't have to deliberately set out on that path. And actually, when you speak to people who have been really successful in life in the world, even from like Mandela and Gandhi, there are all these great leaders of the world. They didn't start out in life saying, they wanted to change the world. In fact, if you look, they actually actively were trying to fit in, and they didn't want to necessarily kind of do that. I mean, yes, you do get the stories of prime ministers and presidents that woke up, and, the minute they could speak, they went, I'm going to be president. But they're really, actually, there's some. That's where I think that humility and that kind of humbleness comes, because you didn't necessarily choose that pathway, and I think that's okay. But also, you don't have to make it to the top. You don't have to be this sort of sacrifice your life. I don't think you necessarily should. I think you need those kind of activists that rise to the top, if you like. They get really exhausted, and so really you need to know when you need your team, and you need to build that capability across the system in all of your people. And you need to look very carefully at your performance management systems to enable other people to come through and emerge.
And I think I talked as well about the compassion, and I've certainly talked about it in the past as well, in terms of, Fulfilling Lives is a fantastic program, but you could stand alone sometimes, and it's quite isolating when you're pushing against a system and not necessarily knowing more than anybody else. It's just trying to push a different narrative, and that can be really lonely, and you often get challenged on it. So, and I'm not the expert, it's just I'm trying to bring different perspectives into that, and different lenses into that space as well. So I totally resonate with and you need to find your allies then. And that's why, we called How to Make Change Happen Together, because it's about bringing people together and bringing those different perspectives and lenses.
And no one will agree. When you create these spaces for dialogue, there's an expectation that you'll all end a day and everyone will believe the same thing, and you all have the same shared beliefs, values, and principles. And actually holding these kind of spaces is really, really difficult, and it's a deliberate management strategy in some ways, that you're going to grow your ability to sit with uncomfortable silences, to hear the uncomfortable truths about the impact of your policy or your local authority or your charity on people's lives. And I've seen some incredible charities doing that, actually taking like full-scale top to bottom up and horizontal reviews of holding up the mirror and saying, I want to hear how our organisation is impacting on those that we supposedly help. Changing Lives is doing that, Mayday Trust has done that, and they've been uncomfortable, but look where they come out. They've realised by analysing and doing that, maybe that mapping or examining their beliefs and their mindsets, that there is no one view of how to fix things. That's okay if people disagree, but if you can share your purpose, so if you change your purpose from let's just try and get people housed tonight, and that's it. That's what we're doing all the time. We're trying to house people. If you shift that towards how can we create and be part of a system that's building better, affordable, quality homes, that changes it slightly. You see, so it's just sometimes it just is a slight shift from, hang on, we need to move a bit more upstream. So I think I love the systems changes that are more kind of gradual and incremental, as opposed to a kind of big bang kind of discovery.
I think they take time. I think also, I think it starts with yourself. You know, when I first came into the program, it would have been easier to kind of bring my experience in homelessness and substance and bring that. We worked out the other day that it's 30 years, wasn't it, Casey? 30 years, and that was going to be the answer. And actually it wasn't. It was really listening to what was going on in these communities as opposed to bringing my own assumptions and biases. And you can lean back on that experience, but if you're really going in thinking in a systemic way, it's bringing in a different lens completely. So, so starting with yourself, I think, and then opening up around the organisations and the networks as well.
So thank you for segueing onto my next question. So I wanted to sort of get into this, if there's any sort of further thoughts on it, this question of, characteristics and sort of practices. I think I like to think about these things as personal practices, because it's not something that one just has or just gets, So if we understand, I think we kind of get a sense of the kind of, the sorts of actions, the sort of approaches that the kind of leadership that we're talking about that is more sort of systemic and create space for others, I think we're kind of getting a sense of what those look like. What are the kind of personal practices for you? You've talked about listening, obviously. Are there any other sort of ways of being, ways of, that we can practice, that can help us be better systems leaders?
I always say I'm not looking at anyone in the room, because it's about giving yourself time. It's about giving that permission to be reflective and to come together. And that's so precious and so privileged. And I think that's why Fulfilling Lives, Changing Futures are making that difference in different ways, and organisations are doing it because they're giving themselves times to reflect. And I do think you need to stop, and that's I'm trying to not look at anyone because I know how precious that is, and it's how easy it is to say. I don't know whether I answered your question then, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. So pause, listen to others, but also to yourself. And, to your point, Nadine, about acting, so act on the basis of that listening as opposed to acting without doing that.
But I do get very wary of kind of, a lot of local authorities want to hold kind of listening exercises with parts of the community that they know are seldom heard. And then at the end of the listening exercise, they're like, right, I need 3 things. I need 3 concrete actions now. But really, it's just the start of a dialogue. You've just begun to kind of build a relationship. What you heard today might not be what you hear next week. You need to keep this dialogue going, and it gets frustrating when you see like tenders going out from local authorities to do kind of one-off listening exercises to completely rethink their whole health inequalities agenda or something, and then you're just sort of thinking, why can't that be part of what I like about? I don't know how much you've talked about Changing Futures, but like what I really like about that is that really the idea is trying to bring that as part of what you do every day. Like that's part of your being, is that you have a continual dialogue. So building that into your way of working, it's not just it's a one-off here and a one-off listening exercise there, is really going to pay dividends in the end, but it will take time. And then I think there's leaders that want to really kind of think about how can they become more of a systems leader. They do need to look at some of the boring nuts and bolts that are kind of driving the organisation, unfortunately. So you will need to look at kind of what are the incentives in the system, kind of how much are we kind of driven by results that are kind of predetermined, what do performance appraisal systems look like, what kind of questions am I asking my team in performance appraisals? Am I asking them what they did? What did you do? What did you do? Yeah, but what did you do? Ask them how they created and enabled their peers and their communities to thrive. Ask them what they learned. Ask them whether they failed. Ask them why they didn't fail. Because failing and creating that fail forward, as I call it, culture is important. Be as a leader, fail openly. Write an email every week to your teams and say, this is what I learned this week. This was my failure. This is how I'm going forward. So there's lots of kind of different things you can do to sort of reset the tone of the organisation, if it like, just by starting to ask different questions, starting to work in the open, starting to admit failures and make failures a positive thing. So, and I think that that's probably enough for now. I could go on and on.
Yeah, it's very interesting that kind of making public your personal practice. So this isn't just a kind of you in your internal meditative space. This is actually kind of modeling behavior. Did you want to come in? I had go ahead.
Yeah, as I said, I wasn't going to talk, wasn't I? I was sat with Fulfilling Lives leaders yesterday across the national programme, and actually the whole and I know Jacob was in that room as well, and the whole conversation was about, wouldn't it, we've produced so many reports. I think Stoke and Voices have produced 85 reports over the time that they've been working there, but the whole conversation was about, actually, let's capture in a paper how we've done it all wrong, you know what I mean, and all our lessons that I've learned, and that speaks to before how it needs to be bold and brave. You need to be bold and brave and courageous to be able to do that as well. But if I gave you a paper of all the mistakes I've made, I'm sure people would love that kind of reading. You know what I mean? So, and why not? What are we scared about?
How important is, so this morning we've talked about complex systems, we talked about the multiple perspectives. Nadine, you talked about there not being one right answer, and this kind of getting ourselves away from the idea of there being a single sort of truth and a single, path. And, we've talked about being able to sit with uncertainty, all these things which are quite uncomfortable. How important is, this isn't in the script, but how important is being able to work with conflict? If we understand that, there are going to be multiple perspectives and it's difficult, and listening, if for listening not just to be a tokenistic exercise where you go, oh yes, I hear you, and then you go ahead and do whatever you're going to do anyway, to really be able to work with multiple perspectives which may be in tension with each other, which there will be in any system, how important is that kind of ability, not just to hold nice space, but to hold conflict space?
I would call it positive disruption, and I think you absolutely have to have that within your program, within your organisation, and you need to be recognising that externally as well. So, and I think that's where the compassion comes in, because if you're responding with compassion, you've got an open mindset to listen to it, and you have to show that compassion back to yourself, so you don't take it personal. But yeah, I've got a team of positive disruptives, which is positive, because we wouldn't be able to do the work that we're doing if we're not positively disrupting. I am adding in the positive, though, in there as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'd like, how much time do we have? Just a quick time check. So I haven't got my timepiece to hand. 12 minutes. Thank you.
Can I just quickly answer just one point to add from that? Is that okay? Yeah. Because there are some really interesting methods. This is what just so people who get frustrated with systems leadership, there is actually some really good processes that you can follow that will help you to hold those spaces and and hear those conflicts and know not how to manage them, but how to ensure that they are leading to a place of truth. Sometimes reconciliation. And I do think that when there has been harm done, and 99.9% of the time it's unintentional, because most people who work in public service and charities want to do the right thing. I think it's about kind of trying to train your teams up, or find those people who know how to work in a kind of very sort of, with those new methods of listening that people are trying out, whether it be deliberative engagement, or whether it's using appreciative inquiry as a type of kind of strengths-based approach to listening, or you're listening for, which people do one-to-one, don't they, in therapies? So they're listening for somebody's strengths. They're listening for the things that we can work on. We can't change necessarily what has happened, but we can learn from that, and then we can hear what is coming that is making someone feel that perhaps there's something they can work on here. Perhaps there's something we can try together. And it's so listening for coming up with perhaps some safe places or spaces to experiment and say, well, how about if, given what we've heard, we try this? That is not massive drastic action, but just a slight nudge from listening. So I think we can probably, if we had more time, we could get into the kind of the methods and how they work in those places of conflict.
And whether it's a lack of trust as well in the system, isn't it? That's where
massive. Yeah.
Again, with we've had a conversation about relationships this morning, about that responsibility to repair and restore that trust, and knowing who in your communities are the best ones to connect with, to be able to reach out and build that trust as well. So, yeah, absolutely, that relational aspect.
I'd love us to talk about sort of getting some specifics, how do you see this work? And you can talk, kind of from recent experience, from what you're doing at the moment, applying in the context that we're exploring in this conference, for programs like Fulfilling Lives, multi-agency approaches. I know you're involved in Changing Futures, those sorts of programs. What do you see as the role of this type of leadership, in these kinds of programs, which are perhaps a different way of working than we're used to? How do these kind of things come together? It's like not.
No, sorry,
sense.
I might have to just run that by me again. How do you see it working in practice?
So yeah, basically. So thinking about perhaps I know you're involved in the Changing Futures program, or other kind of programs that these sorts of Fulfilling Lives kind of multi-agency approaches that we've been kind of exploring today. What's the kind of role of systems leadership within that sort of context?
Well, we actually have someone in the audience here. We have Richard here, who is working with me on Changing Futures, but we're part of a wider team, aren't we? And it's all a big team effort, and there is has to be a huge amount of trust between us, doesn't there? Just, in helping to make it work. But for those that don't know, Changing Futures, £64 million programme from the central government and supported by the Lottery Community Fund, which is working with 15 areas across the country to encourage them to take a trauma-informed approach all the way through towards systems change. And really, the only kind of thing that, from my perspective, very lucky to be leading the team that's kind of doing the learning partner and support work for this is, we're asking kind of, what are you learning? How are you learning? And who is that learning benefiting? And it's really hard because areas are kind of having to think, I have to be actively switch my mind on to learning as a strategy. And that's in itself like quite big, actually. I've realised that organisations kind of don't stop to go, what are we learning? And if you don't learn, you can't move and you can't understand kind of what was working, what didn't, and even the little changes in yourself that you need to notice that really could make a difference later when you're trying to either grow this or explain it to others and understand where you've been and where you might be going. So sort of charting your learning journey is really, really important, and you do that individually, you do that together, and you hold yourselves to account to those people who are working as close to people as possible and with people who are using services as well. So you are creating a whole new governance and partnership system whereby they're people-led, they're adaptive, there's no wrong door approach, there's no right answer. And really in the programme, we aren't saying fix X, Y, and Z. We are saying see what happens if you try it like that. And it's very experimental. We do need to still know what happened, so there has to be some evaluation of that. But I think it's really exciting because it brings together statutory and non-statutory services in a way that I don't think I've quite seen happen before. And watch this space, we will see what happens. There are areas of just mobilising. Many have experience from Fulfilling Lives, which we're bringing into this as well. And, I hope that if in a couple of years from now, we will be able to say that actually working in this much more kind of human-centred, compassionate way did make a difference. And the difference that's been made isn't one that was set by somebody else, but was determined and set by those people who those services are for. And let's see what happens. But it's very exciting, and I'm glad that we've got Richard here and maybe can talk to you about that later on as well.
Great, thank you. Would you be able to speak to this in relation to Fulfilling Lives, how this is kind of, in your experience played out within the Fulfilling Lives context?
Yeah. I think definitely the learning. What I was going to say was, I know that there's practitioners in the room and there's policymakers in the room, and also operational leads in the room, that there's a need for both, especially in a type of Fulfilling Lives programme where we're delivering, we're working alongside someone and they're going through the trauma and, their own circumstances. So there has been a need, certainly in our period, and I look at my team members, that actually there's needed to be a traditional structure, there's needed to be a traditional leadership to allow that learning to take place, to allow that systemic thinking to take place, and to then be able to explore it. So particularly when you're working alongside people, I think that is unique for a programme like Fulfilling Lives. It makes that experience real time. It makes it authentic. I talked about not talking in abstract. I'm talking about real people in our communities locally. So, and I think then when you then see the progression, albeit not across the whole of the sector, because actually majority of the sector works in some parts, but for some people it doesn't. I think that's when it's really exciting to think in a different way and explore whether actually we can test and learn in a different way. And that's individually, but also organisationally. And also we need to strengthen our networks around that, because Fulfilling Lives have got 8 years of work, Changing Futures are building on top of that. So, and other grassroots organisations have developed it as well. Sometimes we're a bit too competitive. We need to share that learning, and that's part of systems
mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a few minutes. I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions of your own. So have a think if there's anything you'd like to ask our esteemed panel. In the meantime, I have one fiendish question for you. We've talked about systems thinking, we've talked about systems change, talking about systems leadership, all these terms. What does it all mean? How does it all work together? What's to you the relationship between sort of systems leadership and systems change? And can you have systems change without this kind of leadership? Is that possible?
That was a really powerful question that I did see, and I don't know, because I'm like Nadine, and I talked about this before in terms of, I've got system changes that haven't necessarily got leadership titles, but they lead change and they're passionate about system change. And you know them. You're probably, the fact that you're in this conference today with a title like this, are people passionate about creating change? So, but do they necessarily have to have a title of system leadership? Not necessarily. You grow with it and you just commit to it. And it is about that purpose, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not about the titles, it's about the, what they do. And what's kind of the characteristics and the behaviours. Anyone? I'm just scanning for hands. I don't see any hands. So, Nadine, if you have a sort of final comment or reflection.
I think I just wanted to say that, a lot of these experiments are taking place within a still kind of quite traditional way of thinking in government and in our country and with the media about like what is success. And you hear ministers day after day on the radio defending their record. They never made a mistake. And there's inquiry after inquiry because there's clearly been some lessons learned. I mean, how many times have we heard lessons learned? It's no bad thing. And I just want it, but sometimes it does. It's at some point, a load of these experiments happening will have to probably hit leadership in its kind of traditional sense to have a real think about the narrative that's playing out. From the CEO to the top of government, and to really kind of start to be able to make a decision to be different. And I've seen private companies doing this. I mean, technology companies are brilliant at this. Unilever was brilliant at that. So sometimes, JFK, let's go to the moon. How we get there, don't know. We'll fail all the way. We'll just. But actually, the purpose wasn't to go to the moon. The purpose was to make sure that the US kind of looked like the best in the world for its technology and its space kind of, space, whatever you call it, program. Getting to the moon was kind of the mission, right? Getting man to the moon was the mission, but the purpose was totally about vanity. But that kind of we will fail and we will fail again is something that sometimes needs to come from the top. And you might not think of Winston Churchill as a particularly enabling system leader, but how many speeches had about failure in it? You know, I mean, he said something like, you know, we will fail and we will fail again, you know. But I actually think that's probably disappeared a little bit. So success is the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm. I don't know, that was his phrase. I don't know if we will lose enthusiasm, and we do need to understand and recognize that we need a rest day or two. But I would say let's kind of bring some of that back and encourage our senior leaders to, because they make a huge difference. Sometimes more than they themselves realise, that they do set a tone. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
Both ways.
Thank you. That's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to our panel for your insights and contributions. And lunch, I think. Rachel.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Nadine. Let's give them a round of applause, everybody.